We were just talking about our name pronunciation because it's the same spelling. We have the same spelling of our names. And
Yeah.
I'm Andrea and you're Andrea. And I was going to tell you the reason why I can do this is because I was a music major, a vocal music major. So of course, I've had to sing Italian anyway. So
You had to sing Italian.
yes, yes, of course.
Amazing.
Oh, hey there. Welcome. It's Andrea and welcome to the Voice of Influence podcast. Today I have with me Andrea Pacini. Is that correct?
Correct.
Did
Yeah.
I say
Thank
that
you very
right?
much.
All right, there we
Yeah.
go.
Perfectly. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so happy to have you here. I want to introduce you a little bit. Andrea specializes in working with business owners, leaders, and their teams who want to be more confident presenters. He is the presentation coach and head of Ideas on Stage UK. So we're going to talk more about what you do in presentations and all that kind of stuff, Andrea. Um, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Again, thanks for having me. I'm excited and looking forward to this chat.
Yeah. Okay. You also have recently written a book. It's coming out very soon. By the time this airs, we'll be in mid-August, and your book is coming out soon. Can you tell us what the book is and what it's about?
Sure. Yeah. The book is called Confident Presenter, and it's a book for business owners, leaders, and the teams who want to become more confident presenters, who want to take their presentation skills to a higher level. And it will be out on the 12th of September. And when I say confidence, like confident presenter, many people think, Andrea, that their confidence comes from wishful thinking or innate self-belief, whereas it has nothing to do with that. In my experience, 80% of your confidence, and I'm talking about confidence when it comes to public speaking, 80% of that comes from your ability to craft a compelling message. I know that in your podcast, you talk about message driven leaders. So I think we are very much aligned. I think without a message, without a story that resonates with the audience, it doesn't matter how good you are from a delivery perspective. Of course, when we work with clients, we also work on delivery skills like eye contact, body language, gestures. These are all important things, but it's not the most important thing. The most important factor is our ability to craft a captivating message. And so in the book, I talk about that. It's a book about how to develop a compelling message, which is simple for the audience to understand, clear for them to follow, original and enjoyable, why not? And also, the most important thing, relevant to the audience.
Mm. We're all tired of bad presentations. We really are. And we're tired of, the old saying death by PowerPoint. Nobody likes that. And yet these presentations and tools are so important for being able to spread a message, for getting the change that you need to make in your company, or get people to buy into an idea. And if you're not able to craft that message like you're talking about and present it in a way that people can receive it, it sort of dies on the vine. It doesn't get that opportunity to get its wings and fly and take off. And so I also just really resonate with your desire to help people actually turn their message into something that's receivable.
Yeah, and that's the most important thing, because you can have the greatest idea in the world. And I say an idea, it could be an idea, it could be a project, it could be a change that you want to make, maybe internally within an organization, it could be a product or a service that you want to sell. Maybe you need investors for your project, for your initiative, whatever it is. Let's call it an idea. You can have the greatest idea in the world, but if you can't communicate it, it doesn't matter. You mentioned ideas with wings. It's interesting because my book starts with a sentence. The first sentence of the book is great ideas need wings. And that's exactly the point. It's not just about your idea. Your idea may be fantastic, but it's also about whether or not you can spread the idea. And if you can do that, then you can be successful.
Yes. Okay. So there's so many different things that we could talk about. One of my first thoughts is when you know that you are stepping in front of an audience that's skeptical, you know that that's coming, and they're gonna have questions for you. They're basically making a judgment on your idea based on your presentation. You know that's coming up. Talk to us about the approach, and what would you say about crafting that message and being ready for a skeptical audience?
Yeah. So in those situations, the most important thing is what you do before the event, before the presentation. So we need to do our homework before the presentation and research our audience's concerns. Now, it's not always possible, but sometimes and often it is. So, for example, I always like to follow an approach where we look at three things: audience, burning needs, and context. ABC, that's the ABC of preparation. So we need to take some time and ask ourselves some questions about the audience. Who are they? Their burning needs. What do they really need? What do they expect from that presentation? And then also a little bit about the context as well. Now, if their research tells you that there might be some tension during the presentation, as you said, Andrea, then you, for example, I'll give you a few ideas. You could ask the audience to send you to submit their concerns, their questions in advance. And I can promise you that the feedback you receive will be invaluable in your ability to then address those concerns.
I love
Also,
that idea.
yeah, I mean, it's not always possible, but sometimes it is. And if it is, we can do it. Also, if you need to communicate bad news, then the most important thing to do is to try and avoid surprises. So make sure that at least the key people in the audience are aware of what's coming. And here, when we talk about public speaking, it's not just about like big conference keynotes. It could be a presentation in a boardroom. So you've got a few people in front of you. Make sure that the key people know what's coming. So avoid surprises if you want to communicate, if you have to communicate bad news. Also, during a presentation, talk to the positive people in the room. If you talk to the positive people in the room, what happens is, and it's an interesting thing, what happens is that when you make a good connection with some people in the audience, then that positive feeling will spread throughout the audience, even with those who at first seemed a little bit skeptical. And I'll give you a couple of other ideas and then I can stop here, Andrea. An important thing to do is to not ignore the objections. And also, we should never fight back. So there is a more constructive approach towards criticism, which is about addressing the objections. And you want to do it by presenting those objections, those concerns in a fair way. You want to highlight the value of those objections, of those concerns, but then you can explain why you have a different point of view. And often, what I see in my experience is that all people want is to be heard and recognized, more than the objection, it's more than raising the objection itself. And that's it. So these are just, I could continue, but these are some ideas and I hope it helps.
Yeah, those are really good ideas. You mentioned speaking to the positive people in the room, which kind of reminds me of the Simon Sinek tactic of focusing on the early adopters. So yeah, being able to getting that positive vibe working throughout the room, and then other people coming along, that makes so much sense. I love that.
Yeah, Simon Sinek talks about it. Seth Godin talks about the same thing as well.
Yeah. And then acknowledging objections, helping people, making sure that people feel heard ahead of time. So I find this to be difficult to do, but I do think that what you said about doing your homework ahead of time is such a big piece of that, being able to spend enough time on it to or to really understand what their objections could be, and then figuring out how to talk about those.
And this is not just with objections. If you think about it, it's the most important aspect of the presentation process. When we give a
Preparation.
presentation, it's not our presentation, it's their presentation. It's always the audience's presentation.
Mm.
So before we open up PowerPoint or any other presentation tool, it doesn't make any difference. Before we even think about what we want to communicate, we need to start with them. When we give a presentation, we are communicating with someone. So we need to start with the audience. I can also, if you want, Andrea, I can also share a story, an example, something that happened to a client of ours. Unfortunately, she didn't do that. So this is something that happened to Marie, a client of ours. Marie is an executive. She's an expert in leadership. And she was invited by an association in Finland to give a talk about leadership. And she was super excited. It was one of her first international speaking opportunities. And so she prepared really well. She knew her message. We were talking about the importance of having a compelling message. She told us that she prepared 50 beautiful slides. And also she practiced properly. So she was ready to go. She flew to Finland the day before the conference, then arrived there on the day, half an hour before the audience, because she wanted to make sure that she had time to set things up. And when she was about to connect her laptop to the screen, she realized that there was no screen. So a little bit of panic. She went and asked the organizers, assuming that they would say, "Oh, sorry, Marie, now we're going to find a screen for you." But what they did instead was they started laughing. They started laughing. And so she says, "Why are you laughing?" And they say, "Look, Marie, you want to show 50 slides, but actually you've been invited to give a talk to the association in Finland of blind people." Blind people.
This is
Now,
a real story.
it's a real story. It happened for
Oh,
real. Now, I know that it sounds like a bad joke, but it happened for real. It's an
yeah.
extreme example, but
Yeah.
it happened for real. You see, Marie was very well prepared, apart from one thing. She didn't know her audience. We were talking about the objections. It's not just about trying to understand the objections in advance. It's really about the basics. At least having an understanding of who the audience is, what their needs are, and a little bit about the context as well. And this is the only way for us as communicators to be able to prepare something, a presentation, a message, which is relevant to the audience, which is the most important principle.
Yes. What questions do you recommend that people ask themselves or ask of the situation ahead of time to take that perspective?
Yeah, for example, so we said, as I like to split into these three categories: audience, burning needs, and context. Now, in the audience, okay, who is the audience? Who are the key people in the audience? What company do they work for? If you don't know, can you ask around? Can you search on LinkedIn? So let's try to understand as much as possible about who the key people in the audience are. Also, is there a second audience? Like, will there be somebody not in the room that will need to know about, or that will be told, who will be told about your presentation? You may want to know. So some questions about the audience. Also, questions about their burning needs. What do they really need? What do they expect from your presentation? What challenges do they have? How do those challenges relate to your activities, to your topic? Do they have any deadlines coming soon? It's not always relevant to know. Sometimes it is. Do they have any concerns? As you said, do they have any concerns about your activities? So burning needs. And then context. What I mean by context is, for example, is it one-to-one? Is it one-to-many? How many? Is it in person? Is it online? If it's online, what tool are you going to use? Are you sure that your audience can get access, can use that tool? If it's online, how and when are you planning to interact with the audience? Now, don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that for any presentation we need to ask ourselves all of these questions. Some questions may or may not be relevant depending on the situation. But the principle is that the more we know about the audience, their needs, and the context, the easier it is to prepare a presentation which is relevant to them.
Yes, yes, love that. Those are great questions. So when it comes to keeping a presentation engaging, I mean, that's what everybody wants, an engaging presentation. What kinds of things that maybe people haven't thought about do they need to think about when it comes to engaging?
A couple of things. There are many things that we could cover. A couple of things that come to mind. One is, have you developed an engaging storyline, a presentation structure? A presentation should have a clear and engaging storyline from the very beginning, where you want to be able to capture the audience's attention, to the very end, where you want to make it clear to the audience what was your point and why they should care about it. And to do that, now, depending on the audience, their needs, the context, there are certain storylines that may work better than others. But one storyline that works all the time is, there's a bit more than that. But if we want to keep a high level, you have an opening, an introduction where you grab the audience's attention, and there are ways to do that. Then you communicate 3 key messages. 3 is the most powerful number in communication. It's the most persuasive number in communication. It's very hard for most people to remember more than roughly 3 things. So opening, 3 key messages, and then a powerful conclusion. So one way to do that is to make sure that we have an engaging storyline that makes it easier for the audience to follow you as a presenter and remember and understand your key messages. Also, when it comes to thinking about the actual content of your presentation, then the most effective thing we can do is to include storytelling, stories. We've heard it for good reason. Storytelling is powerful in communication. The problem I see, Andrea, is that most presentations, especially in business, are 99% facts. And then if we are lucky, 1% is story. We should turn this around. If we tell more stories, that's the most effective thing we can do to make our presentations more engaging. Now, when I say a story, it doesn't have to be a once upon a time type of story. It could be an example, an anecdote. It could be a case study. It could be a client success story. It could be something that happened to you, a personal story, if it's connected to the point you want to get across. It could be stories about other people. So something that happened to somebody else, like in my example, something that happened to a client of mine, Marie. It could be stories of brand success. Say, for example, that there's a company, an organization that's already implementing the strategy, the idea that you have in mind. That's a story. So if we think about it, there's always a story to tell.
Have you come across any particular great way of keeping track of or researching to find good stories? Like sometimes I notice that some speakers have the best stories that are historical references to people that we've heard about or haven't heard about, that sort of thing.
You just have to, first of all, be curious and pay attention to what surrounds you. And then depending on what you do, that, for example, I love reading. And so I find many of the stories that then I use in my presentations, in my communication in general, when I read books, articles. And what I do is, now, if you just read and then you leave it there, you'll forget it. So every time I find a story, an example, or analogies, I'm a big fan of analogies as well. By the way, going back to your question, your previous question, that's another way to make a content, a message more engaging. Analogies. We can talk about that later. But when I find that story, that example, the analogy, I have a very simple Google document where I've got 2 columns. One column is the point I want to get across. And in the second column, I have either the story or the analogy that illustrates that particular point. And I have this big file. Over the years, it includes hundreds of entries. And then when I want to prepare a presentation, say, for example, that I want to talk about this particular thing, all I need to do is, because if you do that over the years, then you have a huge list. Then you go there, you just filter per the message that you want to get across, and immediately you have your analogy, you have your story. And the reason why that's also important is because when we talk about storytelling, this is not about telling a story for the sake of telling a story. We want to tell a story, or we want to use an analogy because it makes a point, because it makes it easier for the audience to understand what you want to talk about.
Yeah, great. What do you want to tell us about analogies?
And now, because you asked, how can we make our presentations more engaging? In addition to stories, analogies are also very powerful. An analogy is a comparison between two things. When you say this, which is your idea, this is a bit like that, that's an analogy, that's a comparison. For our podcast, the Ideas on Stage podcast, some time ago, I interviewed John Pollack, who was one of the presidential speech writers for Bill Clinton. He wrote a great book, Shortcut, which, because an analogy is a shortcut. So it's a book on the power of analogy, also in communication. And he says that in any conversation, in any argument, whoever has the best analogy wins. Analogies are incredibly powerful. When you connect something that the audience is not yet familiar with, it's your idea. Something that, especially if that thing, that idea is complex or technical or simply new for the audience. When you connect that to something that the audience already knows and understand, when you make that connection, that's when learning happens.
Yes,
Again, I can give you examples, but I don't want to take too much time in my answers. So feel free to
yeah. Well, why don't you give us an example of an analogy that you love?
Okay. So some time ago, I was watching a video on YouTube where, do you know, in the US, Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astrophysicist, yeah, great communicator. I think is one of the best science communicators out there at the moment. And he uses analogies all the time. It was not a presentation. It was just having a panel conversation, and he was taking questions from the audience. And one question was, Mr. Tyson, what do you think about life in the universe beyond planet Earth? And he believes that the chances are very high. But rather than using technical, scientific, complex language, which would have not worked for that particular audience because it was not a scientific conference, he said, imagine that you are in a boat. It's just you on a small boat in the ocean. And then you have a glass with you, and you take some water from the ocean with your glass, and then you look at the glass and you say, okay, there are no whales in this glass, therefore we can assume that there are no whales in the entire ocean. Thinking that that makes sense, making this assumption is like making the assumption that because we don't see life beyond us, then there is no life beyond planet Earth. And everybody can relate to that. Everybody can understand, can relate to the idea, okay, if I'm in a small boat in the ocean and I do that, so it's easy to understand. He could have used complex language, scientific, technical language that would have alienated most of the people in the audience.
That's a great example. Any other tips that you want to give us around engaging the audience? I mean, you don't have to be exhaustive. I know you have lots of ideas, but any other ones that you want to share?
It very much depends on what the objective is. Now, another thing which is very important to consider is the objective of a presentation. Now, a common mistake I see is that many people think that our objective when presenting is just to share some information. The audience doesn't know something and we tell them something. And that's why, Andrea, then most presentations, you said you are tired of boring presentations. That's why most presentations are not engaging enough. Now, presentations are very bad at informing people. If you look at how our brain works, we forget most of what we hear within just a few seconds. So presentations are very bad at informing people, but they are great at transforming them. And when I say transformation, it doesn't have to be a huge thing. Transforming the audience means trying to take them from a state where they don't know what you're talking about to a state in which they do, they understand it. From a state in which they don't believe in your idea to a state in which they do. From a state in which they don't know, they don't do certain things to a state in which they do what you want them to do. If after your presentation, your audience doesn't believe, feel, or do anything new or different, then as presenters, we've wasted our time. And even worse, we've wasted the time of our audience. So the key question we need to ask ourselves is, what do I want my audience to do as a result of my presentation? And then we need to be very clear and specific about telling them. Of course, we don't have to be salesy, we don't have to be pushy, but there is an elegant way of including those next steps, that call to action in a presentation.
Let's talk about Q&A. So Q&A is a fun piece of a presentation, especially if it's, I don't know, that's a great way to be able to understand where your audience is and continue to dive deeper. But talk to us about how you would recommend that people approach Q&A, or even preparing for Q&A.
Yeah, great point, because that's another mistake I often see, how to handle the Q&A. Now, the mistake I see is that we tend to finish our presentations with the Q&A. So we give our presentations and then we finish with something like, okay, that's it. Are there any questions? So we end with the Q&A, and that's not the best approach, because if you think about it, you never want to end a presentation or a meeting where you've presented with a question you don't have an answer to, which could be the case. Why not? You don't want to end that presentation with a question which is not relevant to the key point you really want to get across. So a much better way to handle that is you deliver your presentation, and then before your conclusion, so you know that your conclusion is coming, but before that, you could say something like, okay, there's one more thing I'd like to share with you, but I can do that later. For now, I would be very happy to take any questions. What questions do you have? So you see, you told the audience already that there's one more thing you would like to share with them, and that's your conclusion that you have prepared, and you want to finish that presentation. So you handle the Q&A, but then at some point you know that you need to, if it takes you 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes to close that presentation, you need to reserve that time at the end to finish with that. So that's one thing. And then another practical piece of advice for our listeners is this. Once you ask, okay, do you have any questions? What questions do you have? Then what happens sometimes, I don't know whether it happened to you in the past, Andrea, but you ask, what questions do you have? And then you've got that awkward moment of silence where nobody asks any questions. And the reason why that happens sometimes is not because the audience doesn't have any questions, but it's just because we haven't given them the time to think about some questions. So what great presenters do is they prepare, I call it an OSQ, an oh shit question. Like, oh shit, there are no questions. What can I do now? It's a just in case question of your own. So you prepare a question that you ask yourself just in case there are no questions from the audience. So you ask, are there any questions? And then you wait a few seconds, you have a sip of water. And then if you see that nothing comes, then you have that question. You can say something like, okay, as you think about your first question, let me address one thing that I get asked all the time at the moment, which is this. You ask yourself that question, you give an answer, you want to keep it very brief, and then I can promise you, by the time you've given yourself the answer, it's much more likely that there will be some questions from the audience.
Yes, love those tips. So I want to give you the opportunity to share anything else that you really would want the audience to know about your book and why it makes sense. Who is it for, and why would it make sense for somebody to go seek it out?
Thank you. Thank you very much. The book is for business owners, leaders, business leaders, and the teams who want to, either for themselves, who want to become more confident presenters, or it's for leaders who want to develop a team of confident communicators. And because you've asked if there is anything else that I like to point out, one thing that's coming to my mind is this. At the moment, if you think about what's going on with technology, artificial intelligence, robots, we've got ChatGPT and all these tools, people start asking themselves, will technology, will artificial intelligence, for example, change the way we do public speaking? And I think that that's not the case. I don't think that AI or technology in general will change public speaking forever. And I'll tell you why. Now, I'll give you an example. If you think about Jeff Bezos, Amazon, he says that he's often asked, what do you think is going to change in the next 10 years? And he says, nobody ever asked me, what do you think is not going to change in the next 10 years? And he says, that's a much more interesting question for me, because if I pay attention to the things that don't change, I will be successful. Amazon will be successful, because 10 years from now, people will still want low prices. They will still want fast delivery, and they will still want a big selection. So if I keep doing that, I will be successful. Now, when it comes to communication, public speaking, presenting, it's the same thing. Tools will change. 50 years ago, we didn't have PowerPoint. A few years ago, now Andrea, we are recording this on Zoom. Just a few years ago, we didn't have Zoom. Up until a few months ago, we didn't have ChatGPT or these AI tools. Tools will change, that's inevitable. But what will never change are the fundamental principles of communication. And in the book, I talk about the fundamental principles of communication. Aristotle was the first one, more than 2,000 years ago, who gave us some building blocks of persuasion and effective communication. And he didn't have PowerPoint. He didn't have Zoom. He didn't have artificial intelligence. So if you think about it, Andrea, 10 years from now, say that you give a great presentation, it will never happen that somebody comes to you after your presentation and tells you, that was a great presentation. I just wish that your message was not so simple for me to understand. Or I just wish that your presentation was not so clear for me to follow and remember. Or that your presentation, as you said, was not so engaging for me. I just wish that your message was not so relevant to me and my needs. That will never happen. And it will never happen if we pay attention. Of course, don't get me wrong, I do pay attention to what's going on from a technological perspective. I think that tools can amplify our ability to get a message across. But what's even more interesting and more important is when we pay attention to the fundamental principles of communication, to the things that don't change.
Yes. And I would love to hear how you recommend that people connect with their audience too, because you brought up all of those changes. And I know that connecting with the audience has got to be one of those fundamental things that we provide that AI isn't going to provide, at least not human connection. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are that there are three things to consider. If you want to make a strong connection with the audience, one thing is what we've talked about so far, your ability to craft a compelling message, which is the most important thing. Without that, nothing else matters. Then You also said, I think you mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, death by PowerPoint. I think you mentioned, and we want to avoid that. So now we don't have to use visuals or slides all the time, but when we do, I agree with you. We have to avoid death by PowerPoint. It's impossible to connect with the audience if we have slides full of text and bullet points, cluttered, so much going on. People can't read and listen at the same time. So when we use slides or any kind of visual support, it has to be simple and visual. We need to use something that reinforces what we are saying rather than something that replicates what we are saying. And then you also have the delivery aspect. You want to make a good connection with the audience, you need to be able to deliver your message in a convincing way. Because say, for example, that you have a great message. Say, for example, that you've illustrated your message effectively. If the way you deliver your message is not very effective, it's a bit like having a Ferrari without knowing how to drive. It doesn't make sense, right? If you have that fantastic car, which is your great message, you need to be able to drive it. You need to be able to drive your message. And you do that with things like eye contact, body language, posture, hand gestures. So these are delivery skills, which again are not the most important things to consider, but they're still very important once we covered the message side of things.
Thank you so much. Okay, so there's been so much that you've provided us, so many great tips and ideas, things to think about. Andrea, how can people find your book and your podcast, resources that you have available? And then I have one more question for you.
Okay, thank you. So the book will be available on the 12th of September on Amazon, Confident Presenter. People can connect with me on LinkedIn. That's the main platform that I use. Our website for our company is ideasonstage.com. Perhaps one thing that could be useful for our listeners is we have an online tool, a free tool that allows people to assess their current presentation skills against the key principles I talk about in the book, the Confident Presenter Scorecard. So people just need to answer a few questions, yes and no. It's very simple. It takes less than 3 minutes, and then they'll get a score. The tool will tell them what their score means for them, and it also identifies opportunities for improvement. The website there is ideasonstage.com, same as a company website, /score, like when you score a goal.
Great. And we'll include that information and links in our show notes as well.
Thank you.
All right. Last question for you, Andrea. What last piece of advice do you have for somebody who would like to have a voice of influence?
My last piece of advice is, in general, your communication, don't consider that aspect as secondary. A lot of people consider their idea, their project, their product, their service, whatever it is that they want to get across, they focus 100% on that and 0% or 1% on the way they spread their ideas. I think it's a little bit unbalanced. Of course, you want to pay attention to the thing, whatever that thing is. But going back to the very beginning, you can have the greatest idea in the world, but if you can't communicate it, it doesn't matter. So my advice would be for people to start thinking about, where am I from a communication perspective? And if we think that there might be a bit of a gap between where we are today and where we want to be, and we can start thinking about, what can I do to get where I want to get to from a communication skills perspective.
Thank you so much for being Voice of Influence today for our listeners.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you.